the last few sessions, we had actually been talking about the different steps an attacker would typically make use of for doing penetration testing. So, if you recall, the first step that we were actually talking about what is called as reconnaissance. So, starting from this particular session onwards, we will actually be looking at what each of those steps are supposed to be doing in detail, and also look at what are the different kinds of tools that Kali Linux is actually providing us for each of those steps, which attacker or a ethical hacker could actually make use of for accomplishing the objectives of that particular step. So, the first step that we will be actually looking at in detail is reconnaissance. So, what exactly we mean by the term reconnaissance? So, reconnaissance by definition basically came right from the time of history where military battles actually started happening, wherein this was basically a strategy of exploring what the area occupied by the enemy forces was actually trying to do. So, it was more an information gathering phase which one side of the out of the two sides encountering the battle will actually be deploying for to get access about details on what exactly is the enemy area or the enemy side is actually trying to really do right now. So, it was basically used as the first step before really launching the attack. In the similar way, the reconnaissance of computer systems is basically very similar in nature, where a penetration tester, before he actually starts going ahead with the job of doing the testing, will first try to find out how much ever information is possible about the target environment. So, he would really try to find out on what kind of business really the target is actually into, what kind of systems are deployed, and so on and so forth. So, that at the end of the phase at the end of this particular step of reconnaissance, the person, the attacker, the penetration tester will have all the necessary details in his hand to really start doing the attack. After getting the details, we also really call this really as establishing a footprint of a target, where we try to basically make sure that the information pertaining to the attack having taken place is not present as much as possible, and at the same time have some sort of a backdoor mechanisms for the penetration tester to make use of to enter into the same target system in future, right. So, broadly speaking, the reconnaissance is something very similar to what the military teams basically try to do in terms of getting more details about the enemy before really launching the attack. In a similar way, the penetration tester would actually try to get the details about what actually is happening or what is the strategy that the other party is deploying, so that the relevant tools and the relevant vulnerabilities could be attacked straight away to find out how much vulnerable the target environment is. So, what could be some typical examples of reconnaissance that we all would have heard of or would be possibly facing in our day to day life? So, anything that we actually try to use a public source like a Google, right, is something that could potentially be made use of by the penetration tester, because anything that we actually try to put in Google or put in the internet, so to say, is something that as we would be seeing a little later, is just recorded for posterity. So, there is no way that even if the original owner of the data is actually deleting the data from the original source, the data is going to be continuing to be remaining somewhere in some corner of the internet, which the penetration tester could actually make use of at the right time. So, other things could really be monitoring the employing activity to learn what kind of operation patterns, scanning the networks or systems to gather the information. So, some things that could be gathered really here would potentially be the type of the manufacturer, what kind of operating system is actually running on that particular system, if it is really a server, and then what kind of communication ports are open. So, all these kind of things we are going to be actually seeing subsequently in our sessions down below, where we will be really demonstrating the different tools which will give us this detail. So, the more information that I could gather about a target, the penetration tester will be in a much better position of identifying what is the most quickest mechanism to achieve the penetration goal, right. So, the penetration goal is to detect vulnerabilities, make use of those vulnerabilities and then attack that particular target. The information gathering phase that is going to be actually getting done as part of reconnaissance will basically help the tester to achieve the goal as quickly as possible, right. And at the same time, it is also very important that the tester make sure that the existing security mechanisms do not find out about this effort that he has actually put in to gather the details, because if that has actually been found out by the end administrator before the tester goes from a reconnaissance phase to the actual attacking phase, that vulnerability will possibly be getting addressed by the administrator, right. So, it also has to be ensured that this is actually done in a stealth manner as much as possible, so that the objective of the penetration testing, which was actually set forth initially, is successfully met. So, the objective here should always be that the target should not be able to find out that the attack is actually going to commence at any point in the near future from the reconnaissance stage that has actually been done, right. So, this is also very much in line with what is the official slogan for Kali Linux, which basically says that the quieter you become, the more you are able to hear, right. So, we could actually feel that happening within our human conversation itself, and this is all the more so in case of penetration testing, where right from the reconnaissance to the actual attack and maybe the bringing down of that particular target, it should all be done in as quiet as possible, in as quiet a manner as possible, without making too much noise for it to be completely successful and the objective met. So, what kind of services typically go in reconnaissance? It should basically have extensive amount of documentation, because the data that we actually find out as part of doing the reconnaissance is something that is going to be used as part of the penetration testing subsequently in our next set of steps. So, I should have the necessary detailed documentation of whatever has actually been found out as part of this reconnaissance, so that when I am actually as a penetration tester starting to do the attack, I do have all the details in front of me in black and white and not really depending on my memory capacity as a penetration tester. So, what kind of details should go into the extensive documentation? So, the details could be like what kind of tools were actually used to obtain the data, what kind of publicly available resources were actually made use of. So, let us say that we actually try to find out from Google search what exactly was the operating system that could be what could be the potential vulnerabilities in this particular operating system. For example, that specific search query that we are actually done in Google should be also recorded, so that we actually can do the same search subsequently in order to get the background details, if at all during our actual testing phase we want to know more details about that particular target. So, in terms of the objectives, what exactly could be the objectives of the reconnaissance mission is that first is to try to understand the background of the target, what exactly is the business that the target is actually in right now, because knowing the business will give us more details on terms of what and how we could potentially attack the identified targets. who are the targets associates in terms of vendors, in terms of customers and so on, because there could be a very valuable amount of information that the tester could basically get from this detail, right. So, how much of investment has been done by the target in terms of the security. So, in terms of the extensive investment for the network, for the individual servers, individual client desktop machines, if as a tester I could actually have details about what kind of an investment has been made, then that will help me as part of doing the reconnaissance to appropriately handle it. So, what is the target's business and security policies with which I will be able to find out what potential weakness that I could actually leverage on, what is the background of the people working for the target, what are the target's exact location and definition. So, I would actually be trying to attack a network in which, let us say, there are like 20 different servers, right. So, out of which typically speaking, ideally I would not really try to concentrate on all the 20 servers at the same time, but I would really try to find out among the 20 servers, for example, which one is potentially very critical or very important that I should first concentrate on for attacking, based on which possibly the remaining servers will become inaccessible or will automatically come down. So, the definition of the targets is very important, then identifying the targets network. So, what kind of defenses are there for that particular network, and then what kind of technologies are actually being used. So, basically things like what kind of network topology, what kind of network protocols, what are the databases, what kind of web technologies and so on and so forth will be a very critical information for the attacker, because with each of those technologies the attacker will be basically have access to the set of possible vulnerabilities that is there in those technologies, and once the attacker comes to know what kind of technologies are deployed in the target's environment, it basically makes the job of the attacker that much more easier. Initial research is basically what reconnaissance is all about. So, it should basically try to learn as much as possible about the target. So, all the objectives that we actually saw in the previous slide, we will actually try to do initial research on that, and then try to get more details about it and extensively document it, right. So, as the famous author Sun Tzu says, know your enemy in the book The Art of War. So, penetration testing is all nothing but all war strategy that is actually going to be deployed, and so knowing the enemy that is actually mentioned in the book is as equally applicable here for penetration testing as it is applicable for fighting a big battle. So, if for example, if your target is going to be a website, it is very important that we actually try to have all the details or all the aspects of that website ready made with us before we really launch the attack, because that makes our actual attack job that much more easier. So, in terms of the initial research, what I could potentially do is I could actually try to find out various kinds of documentation details and various kinds of data, some of it which will give me as an attacker lot of details are some set of classified documents that could potentially be available as a leak on the internet, passwords information, vulnerability reports and access to security cameras, right. So, each of these kind of details we could very clearly understand would help the attacker in doing his or her job from one aspect of it. So, for example, if I basically try to get any kind of details of the passwords from public sources, then we could very comfortably say that half the job of the attacker is actually done, because if the passwords details or the patterns, even if not the exact passwords, even if the patterns are actually found out by the attacker, it basically helps him to find out what different possible combinations of the patterns that the person could be using as the password for that particular system or network server or whatever it is, and thereby get access into that particular system very easily, right. Likewise, getting access to classified documents or any kind of vulnerability reports or security camera recordings will basically help the attacker in quickly trying to come to conclusion on how easily the attack could actually be done as part of the attack phase, right. So, all these kind of details you will find in the internet in some form or other, and we will actually be seeing a couple of examples in this particular session also. So, there is a lot of valuable information that can be obtained from a target's website. So, most of the corporate websites, if you find, give lot of details about the email addresses, about the background of the company and so on and so forth. So, what I could possibly get from an email address, right. So, from an email address I could potentially very easily get the domain name with which that particular company or the target is registered with, right. Now, when I get the name of the domain very easily, the attacker would basically have lot of data points in the public sources from which he could find out what are the possible IP address ranges that are actually assigned to him, assigned to that particular target and so on, right. So, likewise if as an attacker, if you really view any company website as an attacker, you will very easily find out the kind of depth, information depth that is actually available in it, which an attacker could potentially make use of on a platter, right. So, if you for example look at a site called AREN. So, if we actually look at this particular site AREN.net, this is something which an attacker penetration tester would actually be making use of as a first cut measure possibly. So, RIR basically stands for Regional Internet Registry. So, we will actually see a very small clipping on how one could actually make use of this site to get more details about the IP addresses that the target is possibly making use of. So, if you actually use the URL www.arin.net, you will actually come across this website where first in the home page you will find that there is an IP address that is displayed, and this IP address is the IP address from which you have actually logged in, which you have accessed this particular server, right. So, you have accessed the arin.net site from this particular IP address, and this is basically what it is right now mentioning. So, now if I basically go and type any domain name as part of this search who is database, right, you will find that it basically lists down all the IP addresses for that particular domain name that was actually searched, right. So, this is basically what I was telling just a short while back, that the moment I know the domain name of my target environment, maybe by looking at the IP address of some of the employees of that particular company in their website. So, if the email address will always have the domain name associated with it, like for example it could be the company name is ABCD, right. The name of the employee at abcd.com is what will be the email ID typically given to that particular employee. Now, if I have this email IDs available as part of some of the top level management employees in the company in my website, the penetration tester could first make use of that detail, from that email ID find out what is the domain name that this particular target is actually making use of, and then use the detail that is actually available from sites like ARIN, and then get the corresponding the IP addresses that is potentially made use of by that particular target, right. So, if because the example that we actually gave here was google.com, you find that there are so many IP addresses that is actually displayed here, whereas for any other kind of an organization which is actually a small organization, you might not have this many IP address ranges because they would have actually registered, let us say for example only 1 or 2 or maybe a very handful number of IP addresses alone. If I basically go into any of those listed IP addresses, listed IP address range that I have, I would basically get more details about that particular registration, right. So, for example, so if you see here, I actually have the autonomous system that is being used for that particular range, right. So, autonomous system, as we were actually seeing in our previous IS3 course, it is basically something which is used by the BGP routing protocol whenever it has to route from one autonomous system to another autonomous system. So, this particular will number, the origin AS number will basically give me details about what is the autonomous system ID, right, and so on and so forth, right. So, like for example, I have details on the registration date, when was it last updated, and I could potentially go and try to get further details by clicking on these links also, right. So, if you find here that there is a whole lot of information that is actually available as part of just a simple DNS entry registration that has actually been done by the target environment. Similarly, if you look at YouTube for example as another domain that I am searching, I could actually get the similar kind of details for that particular domain name also here, right. So, for this YouTube I find that the net range that has actually been allocated, one of the net ranges that is actually allocated is this particular number. So, I get what is the corresponding CIDR that is actually used and so on and so forth, right. So, from here we just come to an understanding of what exactly is used, what kind of detail is actually available by somebody just by looking at the DNS registration that has been actually done by the target. So, first how do I get the domain name? It is very easy, I just go and access the target's homepage site that they actually have, and you will find that most of the corporate websites will typically have at least a few email IDs there. So, from the email ID one can easily get the mapping of the host name, that is actually the domain name that is actually used, and then use the domain name in RIRs by doing something like as in arin.net website, and then get the corresponding IP addresses that is possibly being used by that particular target right now, right. So, this is one level of information, or rather the first level of information that the penetration tester will try to get as part of the reconnaissance effort. Now, the next thing detail that is actually available which the penetration tester will actually try to make use of as part of reconnaissance is a huge amount of information available as archive. Now, how do I actually access this archive is there is a site called archive.org which will help you to get details about a particular website as it was containing the data as of a particular date, right. So, we will actually have a small video demonstration for that also. So, if you look at this particular site, it is actually referred to as archive.org/web, and you just need to type this particular URL as part of the browser URL field, and then here you could potentially type what is the domain name or the web page that you want to get the archive listing for, right. So, if I basically want to find out what was the archive listing for youtube.com for all the past years, like let us say for the past 8 years, 10 years or whatever it is, I just give that particular domain name and then press enter, and then you find that right from 2005 onwards up to 2017, right, I actually have got the complete archive of all these past years whatever this particular web page was actually storing. So, this is basically what we were referring to as the point that once you actually put it onto the internet, there is no way that information will actually get removed even if you remove it by yourself from the original place of where the data was actually kept, right. So, the archival mechanism will actually take place automatically by what is called as generally robots that basically go ahead and archive the contents, and something like youtube.com you find that the archived information is available all the way from 2005 onwards up to the current date, right. So, the entire archival for 2017 is actually displayed here, and I could potentially go and choose any particular date or time within that particular date. So, for example, if I basically choose April 8, 2017, I have all these times on which the archival has been taken, and then I go and click on let us say one particular time that I am interested in, right. So, I just go and click at 8:00:39 time slot in the morning, at which point in time the archival has actually been taken. So, this particular URL field basically tells also what is the time of archival. So, it basically 2017 0408 and then the rest of it is the time. So, 08:00:39. So, 8 hours in the morning 39 seconds in the 8 hours 39 seconds in the morning is when this has actually been archived. Now, I basically have the detail from this particular site on how what kind of data was actually stored and displayed at this particular date and time, right, of this particular domain that I had actually searched for, right. So, now with this you could very easily find out what kind of information that the attacker could potentially get from accessing these kind of data sets, and thereby find out what whatever basics level of information that he requires to continue his remaining reconnaissance effort and conclude it, after which he will all be ready for the for doing the actual attack, right. So, any kind of data that is there in any of the very popular social media portal sites, whether it is a Facebook or a YouTube or a LinkedIn or whatever it is, all these are actually available as part of this web archive. Thank you.